Welcome back to Grid Drop. Today we're doing another F1 tips video, and this time I'm going to show you how to master wet weather driving. This video will be split up into a few different categories. These will be braking, traction, racing lines, and tire strategy. If you have trouble with any of these categories when driving in the wet, stick around for the rest of the video, and that being said, let's just get right into it. The biggest difference between wet and dry weather is braking. When the track is wet, not only do you have to brake much earlier, but it's also easier to lock up. I'm going to show you how to tackle both of these issues. First, make note of your braking point in the dry. Here at Monza, the dry braking point is about the 125 meter mark into turn 1. However, in the wet, it's going to be much earlier. Heading into the same corner now, you can see we need to brake around the 170 meter mark. This isn't a massive difference to the dry braking point, but braking at the dry point will definitely cause you some trouble. Braking earlier is definitely key to driving in the wet, but your style of braking needs to change too. Depending on the dampness of the track, you have to be much softer on the brakes. When entering a hard braking zone, your normal style of trail braking won't work. Stomping on the brakes can instantly lock your wheels and send you sliding off the track. When braking in the wet, it's more effective to be a bit softer on the brakes and have more sensitivity on the brake pedal. Let's look at this example again in Monza. Watch my brake input on the dry track. Now watch my brake input on the wet track. Notice how much softer the initial braking is. Although the difference is not hugely apparent, these changes to your style of braking will really help you avoid locking up. Since wet weather has been removed from time trials, to practice this I recommend doing a 0% AI race in full wet weather. Turn off the rules and cut a few corners in order to have some of your own space, and then practice these different braking styles into the corners. If you need to, adjust your pedal dead zones or sensitivity. You'll definitely lock up a few times, but that's all a part of learning to drive in the wet. Next up is traction. Now obviously the car has less grip in the wet, hence the need for non-slick tires. F1 cars are already very touchy on the throttle, so mastering your throttle input in the wet is essential for driving on a wet track. Pay attention to my throttle input for the next few clips. Notice how diligent and careful my throttle input is, especially out of the slow corners. It's very important to not produce sudden increases in throttle input, no matter how much grip you already think you have. Even at almost full throttle, you need to be careful about pushing that pedal all the way down. This aspect of driving isn't all too different from driving on a dry track, you just have to be a little bit more cautious. The car is far more sensitive to jolts and throttle when driving on a wet track, so try to maintain a smooth, steady increase in your throttle input. There's a few more tips for traction when driving in the wet. Short shifting out of slow speed corners is a very effective way of keeping your car stable and minimizing wheel spin. On a wet track, this helps you gain traction faster and allows you to get up to speed more quickly. Another tip is to enter corners a gear higher than normal. When entering a hard braking zone, shift down to second gear instead of first. This helps you keep traction through the corner, but more crucially, helps you keep the car more stable on corner exit. Lastly, lowering your differential can also help keep your car stable. A lower differential changes the power output on your car, and the lower it is in the wet can keep the rear end from kicking out. I recommend using about a 55% on-throttle differential when driving in the wet, and this can be changed in both your car setup menu and on your MFD. Another thing to consider when driving in the wet is your lines into the corner. In the dry, using the entire width of the track leads to the fastest lap times. However, it's not the same thing when driving in wet weather. One of the main points regarding racing lines in the wet is the curbs. When on a dry track, using curbs is essential. However, they become much more treacherous in the wet. Mounting the wrong curb or putting too much throttle down can lead to all sorts of problems, like huge snaps of oversteer or spins. To avoid these mistakes, avoid the curbs. In wet weather, the curbs become very slippery, as water can collect inside the ridges. Additionally, the painted sections of the track are also slippery, and those should be avoided as well. It might be annoying to not use the full width of the track, but avoiding the curbs is essential when driving on a wet track. Lastly, we're going to go over the basics of tire strategy. To generalize, there are only a few different scenarios to cover when considering your tire compound in the wet. First, in a dry race where rain is coming, it's helpful to use your radio commands and ask your engineer for a weather update at least every lap. Once the rain is falling, continue asking for weather updates, and your engineer will give you updates on the preferred tire compound. As a general rule of thumb, once your engineer says, "We're not certain which is the best tire right now, dries or winters," you should box immediately for intermediate tires. From that point on, it'll only get more wet, and dry compound tires will only become more obsolete in this scenario. Once in the wet, weather updates will continue to keep you posted on intermediate versus wet tire conditions. For the most part, wet tires are not really needed unless the rain is very heavy for very long, and intermediates can usually do the trick. In some scenarios, the engineer may recommend wet tires, but they're only useful for a few laps, so it's best just to stay out on inters instead of boxing twice. The most important thing to note is that all of the tips from this video apply both to intermediate and wet compound tires. So that's going to do it for this one. Leave a comment if you learned anything or have questions about driving in the wet on F123. Also, feel free to leave a comment with any video topics for me to make in the future, and you can also leave those in my Discord, which is linked in the description. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.